Christmas in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, 1981, December 14th to be exact. A young girl with an infectious smile and bright eyes called her mother to say she was leaving her friend's house and would be catching a bus and be home within the hour. The clever 14-year-old student was on her way home and wouldn't think about missing her mom's birthday. The young girl in question would never catch that bus, never make it home, and never be heard from alive again. At approximately 4:50 p.m., near the McDonald's restaurant on Topsail Road, 14-year-old Dana Bradley got into a lightly colored vehicle with an unknown male occupant and drove away. Sometime in the next 4 days, she would be kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and beaten to death. The next time anyone would see Dana, she would be laying dead in the snow, face up, with her school books tucked under her arm, as though she were ready for class the next day. It was an unusual occurrence for Dana Bradley not to arrive home when she said that she would. The responsible young girl was uncharacteristically absent as her 5:30 p.m. estimate came and went. This was concerning for her mother Dawn and stepdad Jeff Levitz. Some calls to friends and neighbors would be made in an effort to track down the young girl. These calls would yield no answers as precious time slipped by. A missing persons report would soon be filed with the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary, or RNC. The RNC would initially be reluctant to get too involved and try to quell the parents' fears by saying things to the effect of, "Kids are easily distracted," or "sometimes they lose track of time." But that did not sit well with Dana's parents. They knew their daughter was not the type to just run off without informing somebody, especially on a day like her mother's birthday. It didn't take long for the police to realize the gravity of the situation and spring into action. A massive search would ensue as hours and days would pass without word from the missing girl. Her plight generated a far-reaching media hysteria as papers, radio, and TV were saturating the airwaves, pleading for anything they could use to help find Dana Bradley. The search would continue for a frantic, agonizing 4 days. On the fourth day, with hope dwindling, Dana's parents received word that their darkest fears would sadly be realized. The Levitzes would experience the greatest tragedy a parent could ever experience. Their world would be shattered as all hope collapsed when Dana's lifeless body was located in a wooded area covered by a light dusting of snow. On December 18th, Dale Smith and his wife were wandering around a remote dumping ground in Maddox Cove, Newfoundland. They were in search of a Christmas tree when they stumbled upon the body of a deceased girl in a heavily forested section of the woods. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, were instantly informed, and the immediate area was quickly transformed into a crime scene. It didn't take long to identify the young girl's body. It was indeed Dana Bradley, the girl who had sparked such an intense outpouring of emotion from her community would never get to feel that love ever again. And so began the most expensive and exhaustive murder investigation in Canadian history. Oddly, the body was not simply thrown about the ground. Her body was haphazardly cleaned and found lying in a burial pose, with her books tucked into the bend of her arm. Lead RCMP investigator Jack Lavers believed that the time the killer took to arrange the body the way he did indicated that he felt at least some remorse for his actions. It very quickly came to the attention of the authorities that Dana never made it to the bus on that evening of December 14th. According to eyewitnesses, Dana was seen getting into a light-colored, beige, maybe faded yellow, 73 to 76 Plymouth or Dodge vehicle. The consensus seems to be leaning towards that it being a Dodge Dart. A Harry Smeaton and his brother gave their account of Dana being picked up as they saw it from a relatively close viewpoint. They were selling Christmas trees in a lot on Topsail Road and said that they had noticed a young girl hitchhiking near the bus stop across the street. They found it a little bit disconcerting, but it was 1981, and opinions on the safety of hitchhiking were not as unfavorable as they are nowadays. They were having a busy day on the tree lot, being about a week before Christmas, and went back to work without much extra thought. They were, however, in light of what transpired, able to give a description of the vehicle and the driver. According to the Smeatons, there was no one else in the vehicle at the time. The RCMP soon began searching for vehicles matching the description given by witnesses. Being 1981, the number of cars matching the description was overwhelming, and progress was slow. The RCMP appealed to the public for help and attempted to stir the perpetrator's sense of guilt, as they were fairly confident the attacker would have been known to Dana and was probably bearing the hefty weight of a guilty conscience. They managed to extract a DNA sample from the scene, but came up with very little else to go on. Given the forensic technology at the time, even the DNA gathered would be of negligible use. According to the coroner, the young girl was a victim of blunt force trauma to the head and sexual assault. The timeline established that she was most likely murdered on the same day that she went missing. The RCMP dedicated every available resource to the manhunt and were confident that justice would be served swiftly. With the public alerted and officers working around the clock, it was only a matter of time before the killer would be identified. Over 1,000 similar vehicles were examined. 35 officers were assigned and thousands of interviews were conducted. The pool had swelled to over 280 possible suspects. Unfortunately, all the man-hours worked and money spent were unable to reach any solid conclusion. At one point, hypnotists were utilized in hopes of jogging witnesses' memories into divulging something fruitful. None of these findings, though, would be substantiated. In the days after Dana's body was found, 2 new witnesses from the Maddox Cove area emerged, claiming to have seen the man and the vehicle on the night she disappeared. From these accounts, a new, more detailed composite sketch of the suspect was produced and distributed. This again would lead to frustratingly little progress for the authorities. Dana's funeral came and went with no answers in sight. Reverend Robert Mills summed up what the whole city was feeling as he stated that this crime has, quote, shocked, terrified, and angered us all. It doesn't happen here, not in this community, end quote. Even though St. John's is the capital city of Newfoundland, it had an old-time, small-town feel to it back in 1981. This horrific event had shaken this tiny, close-knit town to its very core. In the months following the event, things did not improve for the Levitzes. While dealing with the grief of losing their precious daughter, they were the recipients of multiple harassing late-night phone calls. The man on the line claimed to be the killer and obscenely gloated about the things he had done to her. The man was eventually located and sentenced to 9 months in prison for the obscene phone calls, but was ultimately found to have nothing to do with the actual murder. Police activity began to wane over the following months as the time dragged on without any major breakthroughs. After the exhaustive effort of the past months, the case had made dishearteningly little headway. Media interest in the story dwindled as the case went unsolved and city inhabitants got back to their normal day-to-day lives. The tragic story of Dana Bradley became synonymous with the dangers of hitchhiking. Though never deemed a cold case by the police, the amount of resources dedicated to it became minimal for the next few years. It was, however, far from forgotten. Tips would keep dribbling in concerning the murder for years to come, and approximately 5 years later, in 1986, RCMP Chief Inspector Jack Lavers received an anonymous letter which named a David Somerton as the murderer. At the time, this was considered a huge break in the case. Somerton was an ex-convict, and this seemed to be a promising lead and worth looking into. Shockingly, when confronted, Somerton openly confessed to the crime. At first glance, Somerton's account of the night in question was very incriminating. He stated that he had buried the murder weapon at the gravesite and abandoned the car at Robin Hood Bay, which is the city dump. The RCMP spent over $1 million in excavating the wooded area in Max Cove and Robin Hood Bay in search of the weapon and vehicle, but ultimately were unable to validate either of Somerton's claims. Upon further questioning, Somerton's story began to unwind and became riddled with inconsistencies. It unraveled to the point where it was practically useless, and Somerton wound up recanting the whole confession. He claimed to have been coerced into the confession in the first place, and the investigation quickly became derailed. Without any physical evidence or confession, the police had no choice but to drop the charges against him. Pressing forward with what little they had to go on would have been a further waste of time and effort. This heinous crime became the subject of various news specials on the CBC in the early 90s. Each episode would mildly rekindle interest in the case and lead to a new influx of information from the public. Each new tip would lead to nothing worthwhile. Also in the mid-90s, a man named Shannon Murin came to the attention of the RCMP. He was connected to various known rapes and murders between Newfoundland and British Columbia. He was in Newfoundland at the time of the murder, and according to many, resembled a police composite sketch. Upon further investigation, no credible link could be drawn between him and Dana Bradley, but in the minds of many, he still remains a prime suspect. In 2003, Darren McGraw published the book Hitching a Ride: The Unsolved Murder of Dana Bradley. Singer Ron Hynes penned the ballad The Ghost of Dana Bradley in honor of the victim. While both of these would help to keep the case in the public eye for a while, no real progress would be realized. In 2006, the RCMP released a statement saying the case was still being looked at and tips were still coming in at a rate of about 50 per year. The case would take a startling turn in 2014 when a new witness, going by the name of Robert, came forward. Robert would name a Thomas Carey, a convicted pedophile, as the perpetrator of the crime. Robert claimed that Thomas was a friend of his stepfather's and had molested him as a child. He claimed that he was coming forward now, many years later, because he had been an alcoholic until recently, and the repressed memories had risen back to the forefront of his mind. Not only did Robert claim that Carey had borrowed his stepfather's car, which was a 72 Dart, he claimed that he and his little brother were actually in the back seat of the car while the assault and murder were carried out. He alleged that Carey had picked her up and offered to drive her home to Patrick Street, but drove past the house and to a wooded area. He then tried to kiss her, but she fought back and started to cry. She got out of the car and started running away. Carey quickly exited the car and bolted after her. Robert claims to have witnessed the sexual assault and murder with a tire iron. The killer then put Dana's body in the trunk and drove to Maddox Cove. Robert claims the body was originally thrown down an embankment, but later retrieved. Robert, and not the killer, claims to be the one who arranged the body in burial fashion and cleaned up the corpse. Robert was crying and claims that he was the one who put the books in her arm because she would need them for class the next day. Robert would go so far as to state where the murder weapon and the car were buried. Robert also claims to have brought this information to the RCMP back in 2011 and was questioning the RCMP as to why nothing was looked into earlier. It turns out that he did sort of present this information earlier to none other than Jack Lavers, the man formerly in charge of the Bradley case. According to Lavers, Robert's story was actually looked into for about 16 months before concluding that Robert was weaving an elaborate web of lies. In a 2015 interview with current lead investigator Kent Osmond, the consistency of Robert's claims came into question. He explained that Robert's accounts varied wildly between his first and last contact with the RCMP. He figured that Robert probably gleaned whatever he could from media reports and worked his story around that. He stated that some of the information in the media reports is deliberately misleading, and Robert took note and presented this information as factual. He said that Robert was wrong about such crucial points as the injuries sustained and the clothing found on the body, amongst many others. Robert's younger brother, who was 4 at the time, also claims that it didn't happen at all. After Robert's case came apart, Robert alleged that the RCMP had enough evidence to solve the mystery, but for some reason were refusing to divulge it. He also claimed that the RCMP were unwilling to dig up the car driven by Dana's killer. Chief Investigator Osmond said bluntly, "There is no reasonable possibility that it contains evidence of Dana Bradley's murder." End quote. Former lead inspector Lavers surprisingly sided with Robert and recommended that the car be excavated. The RCMP still refused to dig up the old automobile. With Robert's claims whipping the public into a frenzy, Dana's stepfather felt inclined to make an appreciative statement about the efforts of the RCMP over the last 33 years. He admired their reluctance to let the case go cold, but also recommended they make the effort to extract the car that Robert claimed holds the answers to the grisly riddle. Not that Mr. Levitz expected the car to hold any actual value, but really to dispel the rampant speculation gripping the internet concerning the murder. He felt that the misinformation floating around the Facebook groups dedicated to the case was harming the true investigation and were not really about helping Dana anymore. He made it clear that while he sympathized with Robert's struggles as a child, he felt that Robert should focus on getting help for those issues rather than interfering with Dana's case any longer. The accused, Mr. Carey, was spoken to in relation to the case, but was quickly ruled out as a viable suspect. While the rift between Robert and the RCMP continued, and the RCMP stood firm against raising the car from the ground, funds were privately raised to conduct the excavation in late May 2016. The excavation of the vehicle happened over a series of days, and during this period, and probably not coincidentally, the RCMP released new information concerning some DNA testing they recently had conducted. This advanced technology connected the murder to an as-yet unknown assailant and definitively eliminated Mr. Thomas Carey as Dana's killer. Despite the clearing of Carey's name, and with nothing to gain, volunteers continued exhuming the vehicle. At this point, the authorities were certain that the whole process was pretty much a waste of time. Begrudgingly, the RCMP sent forensics to examine what was left of the car. Not surprisingly, they found it to be in such a deteriorated state that it wouldn't be of any use to the investigation. To this day, Robert still has his supporters, and Thomas Carey is still considered guilty by many in the area. While the modern DNA evidence has been used to absolve many of the suspects involved, mainly Thomas Carey, it has been unable to pinpoint a specific guilty party. It will, however, be continually checked against the registry of known offenders in search of answers. With everything we know about the case, it seems reasonable that the perpetrator was not from the island and probably carrying out his crimes while he was briefly in town before scurrying off to be a depraved criminal somewhere else. While Dana Bradley's case is by far the most well-known, she was not the only person to go missing in Newfoundland between 1978 and 1982. 3 other females went bafflingly missing in the winter months over these years. None of these 3 were ever found or heard from again. It's not too big of a stretch to think that these disappearances may have something in common. It's very possible that a seasonal worker or vacationer made regular late-year trips to the island before abducting and killing vulnerable girls and then skipping town. No matter who or whom has committed these vile acts, each one has left their own distinct scar on the island's memory. With each passing year, the possibility of bringing comfort to the grieving families fades ever closer to futility. Newfoundland is a small, close-knit province, and every tragedy cuts close to the heart of its people. With dedication and persistence, they will never quit striving for closure. For the victims, for the families, and for Dana. If you have any information about this or any crime, please contact your local police department or Crime Stoppers. Thanks for listening.